Some men are born for ordinary roles, others for destinies that echo through eternity. The moment Tony Todd steps into the frame, something shifts. The air thickens. The atmosphere gains weight. His gaze, sharp, calm, almost hypnotic, carries something beyond mere acting, beyond the silver screen. It's as if, for a fleeting moment, time itself slows down around him, and every eye turns to him. But what few know is that behind this magnetic force that defies the ordinary, there's a man who fought silent battles, invisible defeats, and moments when doubt almost made him give up. A man who, before becoming the face of death on screen, had to confront his own shadows and rise again from them. Anthony Turan Todd was born on December 4th, 1954, in Washington, D.C., a city of sharp contrasts, social struggles, fierce politics, and a history that courses through the veins of everyone who grows up there. As a young boy, Tony discovered something unusual within himself, a voice. Deep, resonant, vibrant. A voice that seemed too big for the body of a boy. Some said it was frightening. Others called it mesmerizing. But Tony, he wasn't quite sure what to do with it yet. During his teenage years, he faced what many black youths endure in America. Wary eyes, closed doors, silences too heavy for a heart still learning to beat. His refuge? Art. More specifically, theater. There, he found not just a stage, but a home. While many sought acceptance on the streets or within imposed expectations, Tony found a kind of sanctuary on school stages and community theaters. A place where he could be anything. Hero, villain, shadow, light. And where his voice stopped being strange and began to be revered. But the path to recognition was anything but easy. He didn't come from wealth. He had no Hollywood connections. He was just another black kid with a dream that felt too large for the world he lived in. Still, Tony refused to be just another face in the crowd. And that demanded sacrifice. He worked in libraries, cafeterias, temp jobs, anything that kept him close to his studies. Through sheer grit, he earned acceptance into the University of Connecticut, then deepened his craft at the prestigious Eugene O'Neill National Theater Institute. There, he didn't just sharpen his talent. He found purpose. It was during this time Tony began to realize his voice wasn't just a physical trait. It was an instrument, a spiritual signature, an extension of his soul. And he would use it not just to act, but to make an impact. In the 80s, Tony started to appear in small roles on both the big and small screens. But it wasn't until 1992 that the world truly changed when it met him as the unforgettable Candyman. The figure of Candyman, dark, tragic, powerful, quickly became a horror icon. But for Tony, playing this character was more than just a role. It was a scream for representation, for depth, for black characters who were more than comic relief or disposable extras. Tony gave Candyman something rare, humanity, pain, a story, and that changed everything. But fate had another timeless role in store for him. In the 2000s, when the first Final Destination film hit theaters, Tony stepped in as William Bloodworth, the enigmatic coroner who seemed to know more than he let on. A character that would span generations, cementing Tony Todd as the keeper of mystery, the face of the inevitable, the symbol of death itself. And yet, he was never just that. While audiences saw him as a mystical entity appearing to warn characters about the certainty of death, behind the scenes, Tony was deeply connected to life. Off camera, he was gentle, philosophical, reflective, always tuned into the stories of his colleagues, always ready to listen. Many said there was something almost spiritual about his presence. And it wasn't acting. In recent interviews, like those with USA Today and Deadline, Tony spoke openly about his bond with the role. For me, Bloodworth has always been more than a messenger of death. He represents the cycle, the transition, the warning, and also the respect for what is sacred in life. In a world where success often demands masks, Tony chose truth. He never tried to please everyone, never shaped himself to fit what studios wanted. He chose authenticity, and he paid the price for it. For many years, Tony didn't receive the recognition he deserved. Despite his commanding presence, many roles that should have been his went to more marketable actors. But he never complained. He understood the value of time, and he knew his mission went beyond instant fame. Time is the true judge, he'd say, and the energy you leave in people. That never dies. This is the kind of wisdom born only from pain, patience, and connection to something greater. Tony always believed there's a divine spark in each of us, that we all have a role to play in this world, and that suffering, sometimes, is just the nudge the universe gives us to align us with our destiny. And maybe that's why, even in the moments when offers slowed down, he never stopped believing, never stopped creating. Throughout the 2010s, Tony Todd expanded his horizons, taking roles in indie films, lending his unmistakable voice to video games and animations, and making a powerful comeback with fresh projects. But it was in 2025, with the return to the Final Destination franchise and Final Destination, Bloodlines, that he proved once again that some figures don't fade with time. They become immortal. At 70 years old, Tony Todd didn't just reprise the role that made him legendary. He delivered one of his most symbolic performances yet. In interviews about the film, he described this return as a bittersweet but necessary goodbye. For many fans, it felt like witnessing a ritual, a closing of a chapter, a celebration of a journey, and a recognition that some presences never die. They only evolve. But all of this was just the beginning. Because what truly shaped Tony Todd, it wasn't the roles he played. It was the silent battles he fought. And that's exactly what we're about to explore. Some roles reveal talent. Others reveal truths. To truly grasp the depth of Tony Todd, you don't just watch his characters. You dive into the spaces between, into what was never said, into what he lived off camera during the years when the world seemed to look the other way. After the success of Candyman and his solidification as a key figure in Final Destination, one might expect Hollywood to treat him as an established star. But the industry isn't always fair, and often talent doesn't triumph over deeply rooted prejudice. Tony, a black man with a commanding presence, a deep voice, and a philosophical aura, never fit the tame mold the industry demanded. He wasn't the typical romantic lead, nor the comic relief studios loved to cast, and too many executives that made him difficult to sell. But what they didn't know was that Tony never wanted to be sold. He wanted to be remembered. For over a decade, he faced a subtle yet brutal phenomenon: silence. The years when the offers slowed, when younger colleagues, many with half his talent, starred in million-dollar productions. And him? He was called only when they needed a dark figure, or when it was time for yet another Final Destination sequel. Yet, he showed up, and he gave it his all. To the public, he was the same, imposing, mysterious, magnetic. But inside, there was a Tony few truly knew. A man wrestling with frustration, with the feeling of being forgotten by an industry he helped elevate. A man questioning whether all that effort was really worth it. It was during this time that he began to dive deeper into his spirituality. When news broke about Final Destination 6, Bloodlines, There was one name fans demanded more than any other: Tony Todd. The producers knew it. The writers knew it. The world knew it. And he came back. But he had one condition. His return had to mean something. It couldn't just be a nostalgic cameo or a fleeting presence. He wanted it to close a chapter and be treated with reverence, not as a gimmick. And that's exactly what happened. In Final Destination, Bloodlines, Tony portrayed an older, more cryptic, more philosophical version of Bloodworth. The death he embodied no longer felt like a jump scare. It became a mirror, a haunting reflection of our own mortality. A reminder that every breath we take is a sacred moment. And then, at the film's emotional peak, he delivered a line that went instantly viral among fans. Death doesn't chase. It watches. Silently. Waiting for you to realize. Every second here is sacred. That line, written specifically for him, captured everything Tony Todd has always stood for. Not the end, but the meaning behind it. On set, surrounded by a new generation of cast and crew, many said something felt different. As if Tony wasn't just saying goodbye to a character, but to a version of himself. Only, he wasn't saying goodbye. He was saying, now, you understand, and in that moment, he became immortal. Sometimes you have to disappear. To truly be seen, behind Tony Todd's towering presence was a man who gradually learned how to become invisible. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. He realized early on, the deepest movements of the soul happen when no one's watching. While others chased the spotlight, he chased something else entirely. Himself. Tony began distancing himself from industry events. He turned down roles that, though lucrative, kept feeding outdated stereotypes. Instead, he gravitated toward independent projects where he could explore the art form on his own terms. And during that quiet stretch, something happened that would change the course of his inner world forever. A city where mysticism and spirit walk hand in hand, Tony took part in a sacred ceremony led by a group of Afro-descendant artists, heirs of ancient traditions. It was a silent ritual. Drums echoed softly. Herbs burned slowly. Words were spoken in languages older than memory. And there, in that sacred circle, he wasn't an actor. He wasn't a horror icon. He wasn't Bloodworth. He was just Tony. And for the first time in years, he cried. He cried for everything he'd been holding inside. For the roles he never got to play. For the friends he had lost along the way. For the mother who never saw him succeed. And for himself. For standing tall in a world that tried so many times to erase him. That night, lying beside the fire, surrounded by people who wanted nothing from him but his presence, he came to a quiet, powerful realization. His worth wasn't in the fame, not in the money, not in the applause. It was in what he chose to carry, and what he finally chose to let go. That understanding didn't make him lighter, but it made him free. It was during this chapter of reflection that Tony began to write intensely. Not just thoughts, but stories. Screenplays. Concepts for short films and stage plays. Some dark, some mystical, all rich in symbolism. And curiously, that inner transformation reignited the industry's interest in him. A new generation of filmmakers, writers, directors, dreamers began to see him for who he truly was. A monument in the world of horror. A symbol of resilience and depth. A master of presence. He started receiving invitations from young directors who had grown up watching him. They didn't treat him like a product, they honored him like a teacher. And Tony, with his quiet grace, welcomed them. He guided. He planted seeds. That's how the opportunity for Final Destination, Bloodlines was born. The writers knew they couldn't just bring Bloodworth back the same way. They had to honor the man Tony had become. And so they created one of the most mysterious and symbol-laden versions of the character. This time, Bloodworth wasn't just a harbinger of death. He was a guardian, a keeper of hidden truths, a spiritual mirror not only for the characters, but for the audience. In the film's most powerful moment, he looks into the protagonist's eyes and says, "You want to know the secret to cheating death? Live like you already died," and chose to come back. That line wasn't in the script. Tony improvised it, and no one dared cut it, because everyone knew that wasn't a performance. That was truth. Behind the scenes, something beautiful happened that most people never noticed. Everyone treated Tony like a legend, but he carried himself like a student. He listened intently to every young director. He observed. He learned. And to every new actor on set, he offered the same quiet wisdom. The camera doesn't see your looks. It sees your soul, and indeed, Tony's soul was always on screen. Even in his briefest scenes, his presence echoed. Because he understood something most actors never master: silence. When used with intention, speaks louder than any line. That emotional mastery, that ancestral energy he carried, turned Bloodlines into more than just a horror movie. It became a tribute, a symbolic closure, a final breath before rebirth. At the end of filming, the directors asked Tony to record a short message for the fans. He smiled, looked directly into the lens, and said, "Thank you for never forgetting me. I never forgot you either." And then he turned off the camera. No speech, no dramatic farewell. Because he knew souls that truly connect don't need words to stay alive. By that point in his life, Tony Todd no longer had anything to prove. Not to Hollywood, not to the critics, not even to the audience. He had already become something rare, an eternal presence. And it was at the close of this chapter, wiser, more grounded, more aware, that Tony was about to begin perhaps the most unexpected and revealing part of his journey. Sometimes you have to walk through the shadow to realize it was always yours. After the release of Final Destination, Bloodlines, the media focused on the young cast, the special effects, and the franchise's fresh direction. But for the fans, what truly resonated, what echoed in the deepest part of their hearts, was the return of Bloodworth. Not just as a character, but as a symbol. Tony Todd, once again, stole the spotlight with the simplest of gestures. But this time, something had shifted. Behind those intense eyes, that deliberate voice, that stillness that chilled audiences for decades, there was a man in deep transformation. After a lifetime of being known for his dark presence and enigmatic energy, Tony began to feel a different kind of calling. It didn't come from studios. It didn't come from fans. It came from within. A quiet pull to step back, observe, let go. Shortly after filming wrapped, Tony began to retreat from public life. He disappeared from social media, declined talk show invitations and fan conventions. And then, without announcement, he moved to a quiet stretch of land in upstate New York, a secluded place surrounded by forest, where time seemed to slow down. There, he would wake before dawn, walk among the trees, spend hours reading ancient texts on African spirituality, Eastern philosophy, and symbolic archetypes. Death, the theme that had defined so many of his roles, was no longer something he acted. It became something he contemplated. If you spend your life denying the end, you'll never truly live. That handwritten line in his journal captured where he was in his soul. Tony had stopped fearing death. He had stopped chasing legacy. because he finally saw death not as an enemy, but as an ally, not as an ending, but as a passage. It was during this personal retreat that Tony wrote one of the most powerful pieces of his life, a spiritual essay titled The Gatekeeper. In it, he reflected on his entire journey as an artist and how every character he ever played was actually a reflection of a part of his soul. Bloodworth, for instance, wasn't just the Reaper. He was the symbol of the man who carries both wisdom and solitude, the archetype of the Watcher, the one who sees everything, yet intervenes very little. Candyman, on the other hand, represented something deeper, collective trauma, ancestral pain, the vengeful spirit of the silenced. Every role, a fragment of a soul searching for wholeness. In that essay he wrote, the actor plays the character, but the true artist is played by him. That realization changed everything. Tony stopped seeing his career as a string of roles and began to view it as a path of self-discovery where each film was a mirror, each scene a lesson, each line a message he needed to hear from himself. With this new lens, his relationship with the past began to transform.
For years, Tony carried silent resentment toward the industry, for the roles that never came, the doors that stayed closed, for the quiet racism, for being reduced to a horror stereotype again and again. But in the stillness of the forest, he finally saw the truth. Every step led him exactly where he needed to be. Yes, he had become a symbol, but not of fear, of resilience, of dignity, depth. And that was the message he now felt called to pass on. That's when the most unexpected idea of his life arrived, to create a spiritual and artistic center for young Black actors, a place where they could explore not just craft, but consciousness. No Hollywood molds, no imitation, just pure inner work. He called it the Portal. It included meditation, listening circles, studies of archetypes, and acting practices based not on performance, but on presence. To many, it sounded like madness. But to Tony, it was just the next step. He had always known his mission was bigger than film, and now he was ready to become a vessel for that mission. True legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you awaken in others. He shared those words during a quiet conversation with a group of young actors in the pilot phase of The Portal. The quote spread in silence. Across independent circles, underground artists, and spiritual communities, no hype, no PR, just truth. And slowly, a new generation began to see him not just as an icon, but as a mentor, a guide, symbol that it's possible to exist within the system, without becoming it. But this new path came with its own tests.
The investment in the center drained much of his savings. Critics called it a utopian fantasy. Former colleagues doubted the effectiveness of a spiritualized acting method. Some studios started to quietly distance themselves, thinking Tony had gone too mystical, and for the first time in years, he stood at a crossroads. Follow the voice inside, or cling to the safety of the old world that made him famous. And that's when the universe, as it always does, answered. And it answered in a way he never could have predicted. When the soul awakens, the world will test your faith. The year was 2024. Tony Todd had just launched the pilot program of The Portal, his artistic and spiritual center for young Black actors. The first groups were underway. The energy was electric. Each session felt like it lit a new fire inside everyone. It wasn't just about acting. It was about transformation. But then, the blow came. No warning. No real explanation. One of the center's main private investors, a man Tony once called a friend, announced he was pulling out. He cited ideological differences and lack of practical return. But behind the scenes, the truth was sharper. The Portal was seen as too alternative to be taken seriously in the industry as eyes. Without that support, funding dropped drastically. Tony had to pay out of his own pocket just to keep things running for 3 more weeks. He sold parts of his personal collection, signed scripts, rare film memorabilia, even a one-of-a-kind prop from their original Candyman set. But that wasn't the worst of it. Then came the headline. A trashy entertainment tabloid published a sensationalist article. Tony Todd trades Hollywood for spiritual cult. Is the actor losing it? The piece was full of distortions and cheap insinuations. It claimed Tony was indoctrinating young people with esoteric beliefs, accused him of losing touch with reality, and went as far as comparing him to controversial cult leaders. It even suggested the portal was just a front for artistic brainwashing. The backlash was swift and brutal. Interview offers disappeared. Brand partnerships collapsed. And within 48 hours, the portal's crowdfunding campaign lost more than half its supporters. Tony tried to stay grounded, tried to remind himself of why he started. But then, he saw the look on one of the students' faces. A gifted young man who, just days earlier, had whispered that this place had saved him. Now, his eyes were filled with fear, not of Tony, but of the world outside. And in that moment, Tony's faith began to crack. What if they're right? The question hit him like thunder. It echoed through every corner of his being. For the first time in years, Tony felt lost. He returned home, locked himself in his studio, and went completely silent for 2 days. No calls, no messages, just silence. He listened to old recordings of rehearsals like he was trying to find his own essence in the sound of his younger voice. And he began to question everything. His career, his characters, his purpose, his mission. Had he really built something that mattered? Or had it all been a beautiful illusion? The shadow of doubt for the first time in decades wrapped around him like a second skin. One especially difficult night, Tony reached for one of the few DVDs he still had on hand, Final Destination 1. No expectations. He just needed to fill the silence. He popped it into the player and let it run. But when the scene with Bloodworth appeared, his first entrance in the franchise, something inside him went still. There he was, younger, that same quiet, haunting gaze, the deliberate cadence in his voice, the air of someone who knows what others don't. And for the first time, Tony didn't see a character. He saw a mirror. Bloodworth had always been misunderstood. He was never the villain. He never caused harm. He simply observed. He offered guidance when he could. He warned, but left each soul to face their own fate. You can't cheat death. Must now confront the dragon of external judgment. And there, in the stillness of that dark night, something shifted. Tony stood up, took pen and paper, and began to write a new public letter. But not a defense, not an explanation, a manifesto. I am Bloodworth, but I am also the man who plays him. And what I've learned is that fear only takes over when you forget who you are. He posted the letter on his personal website. No social media, no press tour, no interviews, just truth, and against all odds. The message went viral. Hundreds of actors, directors, independent artists began to share his words. Final Destination fans rallied behind him, saying Bloodworth was always the real hero. Even a few respected media outlets started seeing the portal through a different lens. But the most important shift wasn't external. It was internal. Tony rediscovered his truth. He realized that to live with purpose, he had to be willing to lose everything, except his soul. So, despite the financial strain, the canceled partnerships, and the lingering doubt, Tony chose to move forward with the portal. Less structure, fewer students, but more authenticity, more depth. When the foundation is invisible, no one can destroy it. That phrase became the center's new motto. And in the moment of his greatest vulnerability, Tony Todd found his greatest strength. Not the strength of a celebrated actor, but of a man who rebuilds himself. With every choice, every fall, every new beginning. And the universe, as it always does, responded. But this time, with something completely unexpected. Some roles aren't written by screenwriters. They're handed down by destiny. It was January 2025. The phone rang at exactly 7:34 a.m. Tony almost didn't pick up. He never answered unknown numbers. But that morning, something nudged him. Something he couldn't quite explain. He picked up, and on the other end a voice he hadn't heard in years. Richard Breener, president of New Line Cinema. Cordial, measured, but straight to the point. He had a proposal, and it wasn't just any proposal. After years of speculation, cancellations, and broken attempts, Final Destination 6, now officially titled Final Destination, Bloodlines, had been greenlit. The script was done. Filming would begin in 3 months. But there was a problem. Or maybe a hidden opportunity. They wanted Tony Todd back, not just as Bloodworth, but as the center of the entire story. No longer a cryptic cameo. This time, Bloodworth would be the emotional and symbolic axis of the film. A character not just connected to death, but someone who understood her better than anyone else ever had. We want this film to be the emotional and symbolic conclusion of your journey with the franchise, Tony. This is your legacy. Tony said nothing for a few seconds. Not because he was uncertain, but because his soul had gone still. This wasn't just an invitation. It was a return. For over 2 decades, Tony Todd had been the looming shadow that haunted the edges of the Final Destination universe. He was the one everyone feared, but also the one they listened to. In every appearance, no matter how brief, he silenced the screen. He made people pause. He made them feel something deeper. But Bloodworth was always left as a question mark. No backstory. No arc. Just a haunting presence that lingered between life and death. And now, for the first time, they weren't just offering him a role. They were offering him a revelation. The new script did something bold. It turned Bloodworth into more than a messenger, more than an omen. He was now the bridge between the physical and the spiritual. A man who had seen too much, felt too deeply, carried the burden of knowing what no human was ever meant to know. I'm not death, but I've danced with her so many times. I know her rhythm. That was one of Bloodworth's new lines. And when Tony read it, his eyes filled with tears. Because that line wasn't just the character. It was him. This role, which began as a brief spectral appearance back in 2000, was now transforming into the perfect metaphor for his own life. A man misunderstood, feared, pushed aside, but who, in the end, carried within him the truths that others searched their whole lives to find. Accepting the role, that was easy. Living it, that would be the real journey. Tony knew this wasn't just another role. He couldn't simply act. He had to let go of everything he thought he knew about Bloodworth and become something else entirely. This time, I'm not going to play him. I'm going to channel him. For weeks, he disappeared from the world. He dove deep into silence. He meditated. He rewrote key sections of the script with the screenwriters, asking them to leave space for the unspoken, for the mystical, for the spirit to speak between the lines. He didn't want the audience to walk out of the theater afraid of death. He wanted them to walk out with new eyes, with a new relationship to the inevitable. He wanted to plant a question so deep that fear couldn't answer it. And when the film finally premiered, the world was not ready. Final Destination, Bloodlines opened on May 17, 2025. Within 72 hours, it shattered box office expectations. But more surprising than the numbers was the consensus. Critics, fans, casual viewers. They all agreed on one thing: the film would not exist without Tony Todd. USA Today wrote, "Bloodworth, masterfully portrayed by Tony Todd, finally receives the recognition as one of the most enigmatic and captivating figures in modern horror." Bloody Disgusting went even deeper. In a symbolic analysis, Tony Todd transcends the role. He is no longer playing Bloodworth. He is Bloodworth. He is the guide, the archetype, the bridge between life and death, fear and wisdom. But the real reward didn't come from the critics. It came from the people. Thousands of messages flooded his inbox, his DMs, his email, his soul. Young people saying they cried during his monologues. Older fans thanking him for finally giving meaning to something they had felt for years. Spiritual seekers recognizing the depth behind the mystery. One message stayed with him forever. "Tony, you saved me from an emotional abyss." That line echoed inside him, because that was exactly what he had set out to do. It was no longer about being a horror icon. It was about using fear to open doors, to stir the soul, to whisper truths in the dark, to show people that even in the face of the inevitable, there are choices we can make, and for the first time in a long time, I fulfilled my mission. The success of Final Destination, Bloodlines, didn't just restore his name. It elevated him. He was an artist who had used darkness to bring others into the light. And once again, his lifelong passion project, The Portal, received a fresh wave of funding. It was now the subject of spiritual documentaries, think pieces. And Tony was no longer seen as a shadow. He had become a symbol, a quiet force of resistance, a man who had dared to live his truth even when the world called it madness. Once you've stared death in the face, the only thing left is to live with purpose. After Final Destination, Bloodlines, Tony Todd was no longer just the dark actor who haunted nightmares. He had become something far greater. Didn't come from the critics. It came from the people. Thousands of messages flooded his inbox, his DMs, his email, his soul. Young people saying they cried during his monologues. Older fans thanking him for finally giving meaning to something they had felt for years. Spiritual seekers recognizing the depth behind the mystery. One message stayed with him forever. "Tony, you saved me from an emotional abyss." Bloodworth isn't about death. He's about what we do with the time we have. That line echoed inside him, because that was exactly what he had set out to do. It was no longer about being a horror icon. It was about using fear to open doors, to stir the soul, to whisper truths in the dark, to show people that even in the face of the inevitable, there are choices we can make that make us eternal. And for the first time in a long time, Tony felt peace. I fulfilled my mission. And now, I can begin the next one. The success of Final Destination, Bloodlines, didn't just restore his name. It elevated him. Tony Todd was no longer just that horror actor. He was an artist who had used darkness to bring others into the light. And once again, the universe answered in kind. His lifelong passion project, The Portal, received a fresh wave of funding. It was now the subject of spiritual documentaries, think pieces, university lectures, and Tony was no longer seen as a shadow. He had become a symbol, a quiet force of resistance, a man who had dared to live his truth even when the world called it madness. Once you've stared death in the face, after Final Destination, Bloodlines, he had become something far greater. Bloodworth, once seen as a cryptic villain, was now studied in universities, as an archetype, as a symbol, as a mirror to the one truth nobody wants to face. But everyone must understand the end. And yet, for Tony, that film wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, a doorway. With newfound recognition and influence, he made a radical choice. He turned down million-dollar roles. Roles that would have only recycled his image as the eternal villain and committed to something he'd been nurturing for years, a spiritual project of his own. Beyond the Veil, but this wasn't just a documentary. It was a pilgrimage, a deeply personal, global exploration of how cultures around the world face death, interpret fate, believe in reincarnation, and search for transcendence. But the project's foundation wasn't academic. It was soulful. If I spent half my life portraying death, I want to spend the other half embodying the meaning of life. He began a global journey. He meditated with monks in the mountains of Nepal, walked through ancient cemeteries in Mexico during Dia de los Muertos. He sat with African shamans in silence, listened to spiritual leaders. But most of all, he listened to everyday people who had lost everything, and in doing so, found something far greater. But what made the series so unique wasn't what Tony showed, it was what he became. Not the host, not the expert, the student, the seeker. Despite his fame, his deep voice, his commanding presence, he stood before the world with humility, with openness, with the courage to say, I don't have the answers. I'm just learning like you, and maybe that's why it resonated so deeply. During screenings, audiences didn't cry out of fear. They cried out of release. For the first time, they saw someone who had once embodied fear, now using it to teach something essential, that embracing the end is the only way to truly begin. I don't want to be remembered as the man who scared people. I want to be remembered as the man who helped them understand why they were afraid. That quote became his mantra. It also became a turning point. Suddenly, Tony Todd's name was appearing in spiritual summits, on panels about ancestry, in global discussions about the healing power of art. And with this new chapter, he began mentoring young artists, most of them Black, most of them from places like the one he came from, where you're given roles, but not voice, where you're told who you are before you've even had the chance to become. Tony welcomed them with grace. He shared his failures, his rejections. The nights he wept alone in dressing rooms, asking the silence if anyone would ever truly see him. Then he'd look them in the eye and say, use the darkness as raw material, but never let it define you. To many of those young artists, he became more than a mentor. He became a symbol, not of overnight success, but of honest resilience, of the man who refused to shrink into a caricature, who refused to vanish into the machinery of the industry, who dared to wait for his time even when it felt like time had left him behind. And that legacy began to echo, quietly, but with power. Filmmakers began crafting scripts with Tony in mind, scripts that no longer cast him as the villain, but as a guide, a sage, a presence that transforms without ever needing to threaten. And when they asked him if he finally felt like he'd reached the top, he would just smile and say, "There is no top. There's only the path." And the truth is, the path has always been the real stage. You might be forgotten for what you did, but never for how you made people feel. With this awareness, Tony Todd began to navigate every step of his life, no longer as an actor chasing applause, but as a human on a soul-driven mission. In a world full of swollen egos and golden masks, he chose the opposite: silence, listening, presence. And because of that, people began to hear him like never before. Interviews with Tony weren't just conversations, they were experiences. Journalists left with tears in their eyes, not because of the words themselves, but because of what lay beneath them, a peace born from transformed pain. Invitations to speak poured in from prestigious universities: Harvard, NYU, UCLA, not about acting, but about creative resilience and life's true purpose. Yes, he quoted Shakespeare, but he also spoke of his mother, his neighborhood, his scars, the nights he thought about disappearing, the mornings he chose to get up, even without knowing why. And at the end of every talk, he always said the same thing: "You don't need permission to become who you were born to be." Simple words, but they struck like lightning in the heart. Unknown artists began sending letters, emails, posts, thanking Tony not for his movies, but for keeping them alive when everything felt too dark. And he answered, always, with a steady voice, but the eyes of a boy who still remembers where he came from. It was at this moment away from the spotlight, yet brighter than ever, that fate knocked again. A new invitation. A final call. The producers of Final Destination 6 wanted Tony Todd back. But this time, not just as Bloodworth. They wanted to honor him. They insisted he be involved in shaping the script, that the character be more than just a link to death, but a symbol of redemption, understanding, and a full circle. Tony agreed, but he set one condition: "I'll only come back if I can show that even death has a soul." And so, for the first time in the entire franchise, Bloodworth appears more human, more reflective, almost like a mirror to the protagonists themselves. A reminder that the end is inevitable, but what we do until then, that's our choice. In one of the most unforgettable scenes of the new film, the character looks straight into the eyes of a young man trying to escape his fate and says, "The question was never if you're going to die. The question is, what are you going to do with the time you have left?" Those words, they were written by Tony, and they went viral. They spread across social media, posters, tattoos, t-shirts. But most importantly, they reached the soul of everyone watching. Because there, Bloodworth wasn't just death's messenger. He was Tony, in his purest form. A man who had lived, lost, fought, fallen, loved, been reborn, and finally understood. Art isn't about applause. It's about legacy. And Tony's legacy isn't measured in box office numbers or awards. It's measured in the eyes of every young person who, seeing a black man with a voice like thunder and a heart of silence, realized they could be so much more than the world told them. It's measured in every person who, after watching Final Destination 6, didn't walk away scared, but grateful to still be alive. That is the most beautiful paradox of all. The man who gave death a face ended up teaching us how to cherish life like no one else. You'll never truly know the greatness of a soul until you witness what it does in silence, away from the spotlight, when no one is watching. Tony Todd, at the close of his most symbolic cinematic journey, leaves us with something far greater than movies. He leaves us with a truth, the truth that each of us carries darkness, but also the chance to turn it into light. With the premiere of Final Destination 6, crowds returned to theaters. And there, in front of the screen, many expected just another thriller. But what they found was different. They found a farewell, not a goodbye in the sense of loss, but a ritual, almost spiritual, as if Tony through Bloodworth was handing us one last key, the key to accepting death, the key to embracing life, the key to living with more courage, more presence, more truth. And it's curious to think about. The man who spent decades as the messenger of death was actually a messenger of transformation. In his final scene, Bloodworth says nothing. He just looks. A long, lingering gaze. Deep, almost fatherly. As if, without words, he was telling us, you already know what you have to do. That creative choice to end without a single line was Tony's own idea. He understood that sometimes silence speaks louder than any monologue, that some truths only reveal themselves when everything falls quiet. And when the screen faded to black, in that last frame, something hung in the air. It wasn't fear. It wasn't emptiness. It was presence. The feeling that we had just witnessed something rare, sacred, human. The feeling that, for a few seconds, we stood before a soul who had fulfilled its mission. Tony, throughout his life, always shied away from grand titles. He never wanted to be called a legend, or an icon, or a myth. But maybe, just maybe, he became something even more powerful. A mirror. Yes, a mirror. Because when we hear his deep voice echo in the darkness, when we see his steady face confronting death, when we feel his calmness spanning decades, what we're really seeing is ourselves, our struggles, our pain, our daily fight to find meaning in a world full of loss. Tony Todd showed us that the real terror isn't death itself. It's not living with truth. And in doing so, he didn't just elevate horror as a genre. He transcended cinema. His roles left marks, yes. But what will truly remain is the meaning he gave to it all. It wasn't about scares. It was about awakening. It wasn't about monsters. It was about humanity. And now, even if one day his voice fades away, even if the films stop rolling, the legacy is already etched, not on celluloid, but in awakened minds. And maybe the question that lingers after all this is, what will you do with your story? Will you hide from the pain like so many do? Wait for the right time to truly live? Or will you do like Tony and turn your voice, no matter how different, how unique, how broken it may be, into a call to the world? Because, in the end, it doesn't matter if you're a famous actor or someone nobody knows yet. What matters is what you do with the time you're given. Will you run from your destiny or embrace it like a warrior of light? The choice, as always, is yours. If this story moved you, subscribe to Success Mindset for more real journeys that inspire, uplift, and transform. Share this with someone who needs to wake up. And remember, every darkness, no matter how deep, holds within it the potential for eternal light.